welcome to CPD on AI and how AI is kind of making its way into various things, and probably this will be a fairly wide-ranging hour. I'm hoping for it to be less than an hour, but we'll see how we get on. Because what I want to do is kind of give you guys as much as possible some of the tools to then be able to go ahead and use your critical judgment in lots of AI related questions that I'm sure will keep coming up. Give me a wave or some kind of raising of your hand or something if you are aware that ADP has an AI policy. You may have been at a talk I gave around a year ago. Good. So a few people are aware that we have a policy. Brilliant. That's great. Now, policies are wonderful. They're great. And if you've got the time, I definitely encourage you to read a policy document, because it should give you everything that you need to know about how we're approaching all sorts of things at ADP, basically kind of a digital strategy overall. But the reality is that we don't always have time to read an AI policy. So what I'm going to hopefully try and do is sort of skip out the fact that you have to read a big document and it'll tell you what you can and can't do, and instead give you some tools to understand how these kinds of technologies work, and then use your critical judgment in the situations you find yourself in. But then, of course, if you've got any questions, you can always get in touch with me and say, is this a good way of using an AI tool? Can I do this without any risk? What would your opinion be on such and such a thing? So let's kick off, and I will share this screen, I hope. There we go. Just unmute yourself and shout if you can't see my screen, but I think it should be working now. So a little tiny introduction to me and what I've been up to. So I'm Chris Fulton. I'm the digital director here. I also serve on the RIBA Expert Advisory Group, which is a very, very fancy name for a group of people who get together and talk about all things to do with data, computation, and AI. We are very nerdy. I'm in charge of the ethics and practice work stream on that. So I'm leading on questions of things like policy. And so one of the things that has happened is, because we have an AI policy, everyone else in the architecture sector has ended up looking at ADP and going, oh, well, you must know what you're talking about then. And they've kind of given us the responsibility to steer how the RIBA is going to be approaching various of these questions. So some recent publications that you may have seen my name put to. So this is the RIBA AI report, where I wrote a chapter all about AI policy. Some nice images there that I would recommend you go and read. You can just Google the RIBA AI report 2025, talking about this thing called the Jagged Horizon, which we're going to hopefully touch on a bit later as well. There's an article that came out just last week in the RIBA Journal about how different practices are using AI and what potentials they have. You can read someone from Foster's, and then underneath the person from Foster's is my face. So obviously we are seen in the wider context of the industry as actually leading the way in a lot of ways. And I don't know whether you feel like you are leading the way or you're at the cutting edge. But you know, my background is fairly varied, and one of the things that we do have at ADP is the ability to sort of draw on a number of skills and a number of teams. I used to be a software engineer working in machine learning for finance and healthcare sectors, so this is one of the reasons why I was quite quick to volunteer to write policy on this. And I also lecture in digital computational design at Oxford Brookes, so it keeps me in touch with academia, where a lot of these things are kind of going. What do we even mean when we say AI? Well, at the moment, AI is exciting because it's new, and artificial intelligence tends to be a label that we put on things that we're not quite sure about yet. it's certainly something that when the first robots or the first computers started to beat human chess players, everyone was sort of like very amazed by this. But obviously, we look back at this in the 1980s and think, well, of course, computers are better at chess than humans. That's not a surprise. And actually, artificial intelligence as an academic field has kind of gone into all sorts of areas. GPS navigation. Whenever you say, take me to this destination, you're using an artificial intelligence algorithm to work out what the best route is going to be. When you go to Google Translate, even 15 years ago, it was using neural networks, which is exactly the same underlying technology that ChatGPT uses, to make sure your translation sort of made sense. And obviously, more recently, we've seen advances in things like self-driving cars and text generation and image generation and even video generation. So what I want to do is catch you up on the last few years of AI from an academic and technical perspective. Now, this isn't going to be too technical, but I want you to sort of be aware that there are some key terms that are going to keep coming up as we go. And what I'm also going to try and do, if I can, is put the chat open in my corner of my screen. So if you've got any questions as we go, you can either raise your hand or shout out or put a note in the chat. So way back in 2018, we had the first iteration of what was then called the Generative Pre-Transform version 1. Now, generative pre-transform, all that means is it's a language model which is trained on lots and lots of text that's found online. And it was trained on 4 gigabytes of text that was downloaded from the internet. Now, 4 gigabytes of text is a pretty large amount of text. It was pretty decent for the time. So June 2018, OpenAI, very, very small research group, released their generative pre-transform, and there was nothing special about it. In fact, neural networks, which is the basically a whole load of matrix multiplication, that's all that's going on in these models. It was very good at finding links between words that meant that sentences could have meaning that could be embedded in code. What I mean is the big question then was computer translation. The problem with translation is that a word that you would translate using a dictionary one-to-one, replace this word for the French version of that word, then makes the whole sentence mean something very different. So what you need to do is trying to figure out, well, what is it that someone's trying to say? What's the meaning of this sentence? What's the most important parts of these sentences? And then you can translate it in a much more meaningful way so that the output captures the same thing that the input had. And computer translation was terrible because it couldn't do this. It would basically just give you straightforward substitutions of words. At the time, language models were actually, and this is a sort of weird thing to think about now, but they were supposed to be small. So researchers realized that what would happen when you trained one of these models on large amounts of text is if you made the amount of text that you trained it on too big and you trained it for too long on that text, all you got out at the end of it was just a repetition of the training data. It couldn't do new things. It would only just fall back to doing what was basically it had been told to do. It effectively started memorizing, and that's a human word, but it just gave you what it knew in its training data. And if it then ever came across something that it hadn't read in its training data, it would fall apart. And they called that model collapse. And so the received wisdom at the time was don't make your models too big and don't train them for too long. You've got to find a sweet spot just in between too small and too big where they perform really well. And OpenAI came along and they said, let's try not doing that on a language model. And what they did was they fed it against all the advice of the academics at the time, 10 times as much text, and they trained it for 10 times as long. So they made a model that was 10 times bigger, and they expected it to do this thing called model collapse. They expected it to just start spewing out just chunks of the data that was fed into it. And instead, to their surprise, they found that the quality of the output was better, was way better. In fact, it was way better than 10 times better. And they did some research, and everyone started getting quite excited by this. And there was a very famous paper in the AI world called "Scaling Laws for Neural Language Models." And what it said was, we found the way forward to computers that can think like humans. And what we've realized is that if you turn up the data, the amount of data, and you turn up the amount of training, computing time, and the power that you need and the money that you need, then this thing will get better, not just better every time, but it will get better exponentially. So what they're saying is, we expect this model to get better at being sort of human-like and producing human-like text at an exponential rate. And then a few months after they released that paper, where they basically said this is what's going to happen, they released not chat, but GPT-3. This is an academic model. It wasn't released to the public. GPT-3, and GPT-3's performance fell exactly on their predicted curve. So they said it was going to get better exponentially, and they released it, and it did. And it was not trained on 4 gigabytes of text. It wasn't trained on 40 gigabytes of text. It was trained on basically all of the text on the internet. So you can see there 1.5 billion parameters. Parameters is basically how complicated a model is, how big it is. Has gone up to 175 billion parameters. So more than 100 times bigger, but way more than 100 times better. And everyone started getting very excited. The nerds, I put a little nerd emoji there. The nerds got very excited. And what it was doing was effectively this. It was, you put in some input, it would have a think for a little while, and it would find what it thought the most realistic or the most human-like next words would be in the output. Now I'm zooming out a little bit because we've run out of space on the graph, but ChatGPT launched in November 2022. And ChatGPT was kind of like an upgraded version of GPT-3, but it had this thing called RLHF, which is reinforcement learning from human feedback. Now, I'm going to pause for a second because I'm talking a lot about text models here. And one thing we need to realize in this last few years is pretty much these text models are the technologies that have been growing. This is the one thing that has happened over the last 5 years that's meant that experts and people in business and people in government and everyone in the world and newspapers is using the word AI. It's this thing that text models are getting better exponentially and they're becoming very human-like. That's it. There's no other hidden technological advancement. Everything is based on these neural network-based language models. However, it's trained on the internet, and the internet, I don't know if you know, is full of some pretty horrible stuff. It can be a bit nasty at times, and GPT-3 had a real problem, which it would talk to you very, very nicely like a lovely human being, and you'd have amazing conversations with it. And then suddenly it would say something incredibly racist, or it would tell you how to make a bomb, or it would react to you in a way that was incredibly negative or just downright rude. And they realized they can't put this in the hands of normal people because, well, in fact, actually, Microsoft a couple of years earlier had tried. They released a chat bot, and basically it became very, very racist very, very quickly, and it wasn't very good for people. So what they did was they engaged huge amounts of humans to tweak, after the model had been trained, they tweaked a lot of settings, and they tweaked things like system prompts, and they did all sorts of stuff where basically the person training it or the person tweaking it would have two outputs on their screen, and they would just stare at their screen for 10 hours a day, and they would pick the output that was more preferred or less racist or whatever. And then over time, what that did is it turned the model into something that could be a bit tamed. So it was cleaned up. It wasn't racist anymore. And they released it to the public, and stars were in everybody's eyes because this exponential increase seemed to be going. And the conversation was very simple. It was just, if this thing keeps getting exponentially bigger and better and more lifelike, more like human text, and more seeming to sort of have these reasoned conversations where it could really talk you through what it was seemed to be thinking, and you'd have these wonderful, intense conversations with it, then how long before this thing starts to be basically as clever as a human? And they called that artificial general intelligence. So it could basically do everything a human could do, just generally. Whatever a human would be presented with, this model would be able to do exactly the same thing. And they said, well, we're now on GPT, 3.5, we've got GPT 4, it's absolutely fitting this exponential curve. Probably 6 or 7 will be about as good as a human if it just keeps going like this. Unfortunately, exponentials aren't always don't always behave the way that you think they might. So I've got a little example here. This is my firstborn son, Tommy. This is a week after he was born. And you see there's a little turtle next to him, a little soft toy, and he's having a lovely sleep there. And then 3 months later, he's got the same turtle next to him. So you can see how much he's grown, right? And so I performed a bigness analysis. And it's quite easy to see that, basically in 3 months, he's effectively sort of doubled in size, thereabouts. He's certainly doubled in weight, and he is doing well, this little kid. And then you look at this and you think, okay, well, every 3 months, he's doubling in size. The question I want to ask is, well, he's now 4.5. So does someone want to just put your hand up or put something in the chat and tell me, how big do you think my little Tommy would be at 4.5 if he kept doubling in size every 3 months? I'll give you a clue if you want. Here's a map of Oxford, and there's ADP.
Do you need to zoom out to the map of UK?
Do I need to zoom out to the map of the UK? Any advance on that? Well, actually, Adrian, you're right. I was having you on. His head would be at ADP Oxford and his foot would be at ADP London. So at some point, this exponential thing in the real world tends to stop. And the question on everybody's lips as AI has gotten better and better and better is this thing going to keep going? Because imagine an AI that is basically like this massive, super intelligent thing that just keeps growing and keeps getting better and better and better, or whatever you put at it. That's a pretty scary thought, right? I'm trying to think how scared I'd be, my son being the size of 4 major cities. But everyone started going a bit crazy. And the reason they started going crazy is because also every time you build a bigger model, you've gone from 175 billion parameters in 2020, which cost a lot of money, to 1.76 trillion parameters in March 2023. These things are eating up massive amounts of money, massive amounts of power, huge amounts of data. And the expectation is that the reason you want to put all of this money in is because it's a race to get to this brain up here, this human level intelligence that can basically do everything that a human can. And if we just keep going and just put more money in. Now, of course, unfortunately, the real world has a habit of putting an end to our expectations there. There is a point at which this exponential scaling law no longer holds. And recently, just in August, GPT-5 was released. with an unknown data set. They didn't tell us what they trained it on. They didn't tell us how big it is. But what everyone does know is that the quality of the output of GPT-5 is not exponentially better than the quality of the output of GPT-4. It might be a bit better, it might be quite a lot better, but it's not exponential. It's not on our way to being as good as a human. And many people, myself included actually, have been saying for a while, it's not, you can't just throw all the text in the world, including all the racist stuff, and expect that out of that is going to become a super intelligence, more intelligent than humans. What instead we tend to find is that it tends towards this average of the data set. $560 billion, all on that one simple idea, which is make the model bigger. And these models are keeping going. There's lots of them. There will be a lot of effort going into making them more intelligent, more involved. But this has basically put us in this position where only a couple of years ago, the idea of human-like text generation was science fiction. The fact that you can basically now have a conversation with a chatbot that will help you solve a problem, and you can generate incredibly realistic looking images. You can even create videos. So the video that's going behind this at the moment is completely generated by AI. This is you can tell actually because the length of the shots are all very small, because it costs a huge amount to make very long shots where everything kind of carries on in what's the word, consistent ways. So AI generated video is usually sub 5 seconds per shot. So you'll often see lots and lots of cuts. And when you've got a really good data set, or you've had that specific kind of reinforcement training or post-training, these models can perform exceptionally well. What I want to do, though, is now let's watch that video again. And I want to just invite anyone to make any comments on what you notice about this output. Specifically, where is this house that's being designed? Oh, sorry, I've stopped the video. I'm just going to carry on. There we go. So, having had a quick look at that, any thoughts on what you've just seen? Obviously, the pixels are amazing. The quality of the video is quite intoxicating. Any comments on what you can notice about that?
The landscape keeps changing.
Yeah, the thing that got me was there's a shot where the house looks like it's right by a lake, and then the next shot it's up a mountain miles away from a lake. And then the next shot is right by a lake again, and then it's in a mountain with no lake. Not to mention that, you know, what shape is the house? Does anyone know what shape it is?
It's not the straw.
What's that? Trudy?
That keeps changing.
Yeah, basically every shot it's a different house. I don't even know. I'm not entirely sure how many stories it has. Does it have 2 stories or is it 1 story? Not sure. And so a lot of these kinds of, especially the image generation, it really suffers from problems of kind of consistency and control, and the output can be really evocative and incredibly high quality. But it's basically sort of taking a lot of the decisions that we might make as architects and kind of making them very fuzzy, maybe that's a useful thing at some point in a project, but often it's kind of an unhelpful thing because it implies, if I showed this to a client, for example, who wanted some amazing house in the mountains, they say, I want this. Well, at some point you've got to deliver, and you've got to decide, well, are we building this house by the lake or are we in the mountains? And the client says, well, I want that. Well, you can't have both. Do you want a really big house with 2 stories, or do you want a house with 1 story? I want that, but I don't know what that is. It's very difficult to actually put your finger on. So I've kind of moved there from LLMs or large language models to image generation because those are the 2 really big main pieces of technology that have moved on. But image generation is actually completely underpinned by the same GPT large language models. So what that does is saying, instead of complete this sentence for me, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog or whatever, that large language model is then put to use in changing the pixels of an image rather than putting the next word in a sentence. In fact, actually, technically, it's denoising an image. So it starts with random generated noise, and then it goes through a real, like a huge number of iterations where it tries to take away the noise and find the thing that was there before. It imagines that there was something underneath the noise, and that thing is described by words, and that's where the large language model supports that output. If you've ever wondered why is it that we're prompting image generators with text, well, the reason is because they're based on large language models. And where you have lots of training data, the output can be very high quality. In fact, it's very difficult to tell the difference between what's real and what's generated by AI. However, it does often struggle with things like real consistent reality, certainly physics. I've got some of my favorite outputs. I just want to show you some favorite outputs here. Things like these models, they really do have no understanding of what truth is. So on average, and this is very wide, so some situations you might find yourself 40% of what you ask a model is going to give you something that basically has no basis in fact. But on average, you should expect that for every 10 questions you ask, you should assume that 2 responses are going to contain factual errors. That's kind of a rough, good rule of thumb right now. 20% hallucination. They call it hallucination rates, which basically is just the thing is trained so well to just give you realistic text that it doesn't really care whether that text is correct or not. It doesn't actually have any understanding of what truth is, what correctness is. It just says the next word would probably be this in this situation. I'm going to come back to some of these, but some of my favorite outputs, I mean, these are actually quite easy to spot when you zoom in, that things will just not make any geometrical sense, or things will be sort of like really odd in some way. Especially when you really zoom in, everything kind of gets very weirdly sort of pointillistic or impressionistic, but not in a way that a painter would potentially like. And very famously, when these models were very young and starting to come out, they were very bad at hands and arms. You can see there that's someone with 6 fingers, I believe, plus a thumb, so 7 in total. And then these things can actually be very, very subtle, but you can see things like reflections that don't always make a huge amount of sense. You can see lights that reflect in sort of slightly odd ways, staircases that simply lead to nowhere or that clash into one another. Obviously, the feel of it is right, but the actual spaces and spatiality is really wrong. This is one of my favorites. This is a boy with 3 legs. Not entirely sure where the third one came from or how it's connected. And can anyone notice what's wrong with this picture? The one on the right. Keep looking when you see it.
Kind of covering the image, Chris.
Oh, am I? Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh yeah. There you go. Move this out of the way.
She's got an
Giraffe.
exceptionally long neck.
A very, very long neck. Makes perfect sense to the model because it doesn't know what a neck is. It just knows that the pixels kind of look right, and it will just sort of cover over whatever it thinks. There's this fuzziness to a lot of the output, so it can really struggle with straight lines, which for an architect is kind of annoying. You're like, well, come on, straight lines are easy, right? Come on, sort it out. Anything that has a repeated or an organic pattern, things will kind of feel quite saturated and photoshopped, and the details will be quite inconsistent. And there was a hope, it certainly was a couple of years ago anyway, that if what you could do would be to bring together the text generation and the image generation to these models, they started to call it multimodal models. And the idea was that you could train your model not just on text, but also imagery. And then suddenly it would be like giving a child not just access to books, but also access to vision. It could see the world and it would start to understand. Unfortunately, it didn't really help. So if you ask ChatGPT or I think this was something like Claude, draw a picture of 5 different basic geometric shapes and label each one. So this is something that a school child could very easily do. And it really struggles. Obviously, very difficult to label with text because it's generating the pixels for the text, and these pixels are kind of like a bit fiddly. A rectangle doesn't quite have 5 sides, but good try. An ace-tangle, a cornurus fagios, and an itiangle, which also has 5 sides. And we did ask for 5 different basic geometric shapes. So sorry, this one definitely not going to work very well. It's got 4. This one's kind of getting there, but not quite sure on the perspective there. This is probably the closest, but certainly not performance that you would expect to be signposting the way to artificial general intelligence. There's also obviously a hope that maybe this thing could do some aspects of our jobs as architects. I think the more you look at this image, and I kind of keep staring at it, and I always find something new every time I look at it. For those of us with any kind of technical background at all, we might be starting to worry a little bit about labeling and how exactly this build-up is put together. Not entirely sure what an exterior brick Vibrise is, but it's certainly not whatever it's pointing to. So it's worth just taking a sigh of relief and maybe thinking, for now, the kind of cutting edge stuff isn't completely out of our remit just yet. If you're into bicycles, this is one of my favorites. This is trying to label a bicycle with different parts. The more you look, the more you find. Whatever a derailleur is. And the video generation was hoped this would kind of like give you an understanding of physics, give these models a real understanding of physics, because you could train it on videos of like balls bouncing and people jumping, and it would start to understand like, well, oh, maybe gravity is down and maybe this is the way that bodies move. This is what video generation thinks yoga looks like. And as you can see, the quality of it is just so pixel perfect, and it's got this kind of lovely glow to it, but really disturbing. Very, very odd. Now, in terms of AI-specific tools, I also want to give you a sort of like really, really brief rundown here of these 2 main categories of architecture-specific AI tools. The ones on the left, this is based on these LLMs, based on these rapidly, exponentially increasing, clever, brand new algorithms. And so what most of these models, well, really the only thing they can deal with is text and pixels. So it's linear data. That's how they're built. So you have to have pixels. It can't really deal with vectors. Certainly not yet. There's just too many dimensions to setting up a vector image that pixels, you can kind of like make the pixels blur into focus, but with vectors it's much more difficult. Now, obviously that's led to a real explosion and interest in architecture-specific AI tools, especially in our sector. And what many organizations, what many startups have done is that they've said, these tools, these LLM tools, are not actually that good at generating things like floor plans. If you zoom into these things, they just make no sense. No one knows where the front door is. There's no windows. How's the light going to get in there? What on earth is growing in that flower pot? And it's very difficult to control these things because every time you try and do something different, it'll sort of like push you in a different direction. It's quite difficult to steer them. So what you can do is you can go back to, say, the 80s and the 90s and find existing generative and computational and parametric algorithms. So these have been well established for a long time. This is a graph-based adjacency diagram for a floor plan. And all it's doing is saying, well, in my floor plan, I want things that are kind of beige to be next to things that are pink and things that are blue. And then I don't mind if this green room is kind of not immediately accessible from my beige room. And what it can do is then generate you some different floor plans where that is true. So if you look at this, there's a door always leading from a yellow room into the beige room, yellow room into the beige room, but the green one is always kind of behind another door. And that's really exciting for people in the 1980s because they were trying to sort of say, can we mathematicalize the production of space or the production of floor plans? Unfortunately, from an architectural perspective, these floor plans really leave a lot to be desired. They are pretty not very nice to live in. They give you very odd shapes, and they aren't particularly great uses of your time. Better to just take a pencil and paper and iterate over some sketching. This is brand new. This is called Finch. It costs thousands and thousands of pounds a year. It's a generative floor plan designer. And these little videos are from their website. And the idea is that you can effectively sort of set your layout, and it will fill in apartment floor plans. And you might think to yourself, well, brilliant, eh? Well, that's really good. It's worth just stopping for a second, and what I'm actually going to do is pause these videos, and then this one here, just watch this room where my mouse is, and as we move the video around, what you'll see is there's really only 2 or 3 floor plans, and all it's doing is kind of moving between the two. And then when we stop and actually look at this, I'm looking at that floor plan and I'm a little bit confused. Why is this room offset? Why have we got a whole sort of corridor through here into a single bedroom, and then we've got this kind of weird horseshoe-shaped public space? Why not push that bedroom back and have the doors at this side? As an architect, you kind of read these things and you kind of get a little bit like, it looks really amazing when you look at these things flashing around and how fast they can move. But if you then actually stop and try and sort of come to an understanding of how these plans are actually being put out, then it can be quite disorientating. You sort of start to not really believe what's true anymore. I can spend a bit more time on this, but this is something actually I saw on LinkedIn. I contacted the guy and said, can I use this as an example? I'm going to leave aside the sort of profoundly anti-sustainability message, but what he did was he took this original image and then he prompted an AI image generator to say, can you change timber to steel? Now, obviously, I don't know why you would ever want to do that, but he wanted to know what it would look like. And this is what it came up with. And at first glance, it's actually pretty impressive. Like it's kept a lot of the detail around here. It sort of kept it. The light's the same. This kind of pole thing out here, it's kept it kind of the same. But then as an architect, you also sort of stop and look at the whole thing and say, well, yeah, but we have an understanding of how timber works structurally, and we also have an understanding of how steel works structurally, right? And if you just replace every timber beam with a steel beam, you're going to end up with far too much steel. You don't need this many steel joists that deep on those kind of 400 millimeter centers. I mean, and you certainly don't need another one of these in the middle of the room and then another column here. All it's doing is it's really good at the pixels, but they don't always make a lot of sense in the real world, and they don't really respond well to you then kind of nudging it. So what you can't do then with this model is, or these models, is have an architectural conversation. You can't say, listen, yeah, put it in steel, but also can you put the joists on a different center? Can you remove the middle one? It's the kind of conversation you might have with another architect or an assistant. They aren't able to converse like that. Certainly not at the moment, anyway. Also, I really like this one. It's got obviously picked up that the chair's made of wood, and so it's turned the wood into Corten steel, which I don't know whether mid-century modern chairs kind of like that or not, but there you go. So this is something we've been playing around with for a little while. About 8 months ago, we did some extra sort of emerging technology research with the digital group. And kind of the basic situation with a lot of these models is that the amount of control is quite lacking still at the moment, and they don't have that domain-specific knowledge about you being an expert in architecture and kind of being able to understand what you're wanting to say. And they can't really reason. They can't sort of second guess you or take a step in your direction. Technical debt using these, this is something that the computer coding industry have definitely found can increase. So you could basically do something that makes life easy for you right now, but it pushes that problem down the road. Best when you've just got a blank slate, when you don't mind whether the house is next to the lake or up the mountain. You've got this kind of much more like, let's just explore options, sort of the mood boarding. And then we did a race here in Oxford, where we had a little project come in, and a couple of people used AI tools, and we also, I think it was Ben, wasn't it? Ben Wallace. We gave him a pen and a pencil and a couple of hours in Photoshop, and said, right, whoever can do this first gets to put their image into the proposal. And the pen and paper won by, I think, approximately a day. It was significant. Actually, the Gen AI workflow was basically just lots and lots of trying things out, not getting what you wanted, sort of binning a prompt, trying again, taking little bits, trying to composite them in Photoshop, but they didn't quite work. Now, there are more issues that I'm sure we can go through. If you're concerned at all about the environmental impact, training one of these models is the equivalent of powering the entirety of San Francisco for 3 days. So we're not talking about small uses of power here. And an average query, if you ask something like ChatGPT, or in our case, Copilot, which is the Microsoft version of GPT, it's basically the same model under the hood, ask it to write an average length email, and it will use the same amount of power as running an incandescent light bulb for about 18 minutes, and some indication that about half a liter of fresh water will be wasted just on that single prompt. And you can imagine, if you have billions of users using that every day, that's a huge amount of energy. From an architectural point of view, liability and legal risks are really key to be aware of, that you are responsible for what you write. Unfortunately, it's not the case that you can say, well, ChatGPT told me that, or Copilot told me that, and then you can kind of fall back on that as a protection. and lawyers have been really caught out. This is not an isolated incident in the world of legal representation. Many lawyers across the world are finding that judges are throwing out their cases, or in some cases even striking them off, because they just are generating false and sort of nonsense case work using ChatGPT. Copyright infringement, again, from an architectural perspective, not something we spend a lot of time thinking about, but here's an example that Midjourney, version 6 of Midjourney, it's very easy in Midjourney to output an exact copy, pretty much, a very similar, almost exact copy of a specific frame of a film, which shows, first of all, that it's really obvious that these models were trained on copywritten data in the first place, but also that you can unwittingly generate something that has copyright. So currently, Midjourney is being sued by Warner Brothers, Disney, and NBC Universal because effectively what they're saying is, not only did you steal our stuff, but all of your users are producing things that may or may not be exact copies of things we've already copyrighted. So you can't be sure that what's come out of a text or an image model isn't actually text that it actually exists somewhere, and it's simply being spat out. Then some of my favorite outputs from this is the most recent. This is the up-to-date ChatGPT 5, just released. Incredible power. How many R's are there in strawberry? The word strawberry contains 2 R's. Are you sure? This is the right is my prompt, and the left is the output of the model. Yes, I'm sure the word strawberry has exactly 2 R's, but it's strawberry. Look at the capitals and count again. Even considering the capitalization, strawberry still has 2 R's. The capital letters don't change the count. Str, that's 1. Bear, that's 2. R, that's 3. E. Now count correctly. It looks like there's been a misunderstanding. In the word strawberry, regardless of how you break it down, there are still 2 R's. It just doesn't give up. This is a really nice little flip of that. How many strawberries are there in the word R? And the letter R has 3 strawberries, and it took 11 seconds to think about that one. So really coming into land now, but things that these current Gen AI models, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say the current Gen AI models are probably not a bad guide for what we will have for at least the next year or so. And I'd be very surprised if we saw anything like the kind of continuation of that exponential growth over the next few years. But they're really great at stuff where accuracy isn't critical, you don't need or you can't afford an expert. You're not an expert, and I'll come back to this point in a second, and you wouldn't otherwise outsource it. So it's like, these are the questions I tend to ask myself when I say, is this going to be a useful thing to get an AI to do, or get a chatbot to do, or get an image generation tool like Copilot or Firefly is the Adobe version of it to do? I've given you a silly example, but writing a birthday card for your dog. Like, no one cares about the accuracy of that, certainly not your dog. But if you can't think of what to write and you just need something, you're not expert at talking dog, and you wouldn't otherwise go and spend lots of money on getting a dog translator for your birthday card. It's a perfect situation where this thing can sort of like just take away the white page. Give me an introduction to a certain topic. I don't know anything about that topic. I don't know whether I even want to go and find out about that thing. And it's not really worth my time to go and find out whether I need to know about that thing. Could you give me a really brief introduction, and then I'll make a decision about whether I need to look into it further myself. This is one that actually a few people in Oxford identified quite early on, which is I'm about to have a call with some specialist consultant who works in acoustics or windows or an area where they are definitely going to know what they're talking about and you are definitely not. And You don't want to have a conversation with that expert where you're trying to be better than them at it, but you maybe are a bit worried about looking dumb and not knowing what some words might mean. So you say, what are the kind of phrases that I need to be aware of that someone who's an expert in aluminium windows might talk to me about? And then you can start to have that conversation. It gives you a leg up onto that conversation. You're still going to an expert, you're still receiving wisdom from them, but it gives you that sort of leg up so you don't feel like you're going in completely cold. Last one. Hopefully these aren't the same events, but help me come up with some good questions to ask on a date, or help me to come up with some good questions to ask in my performance review. Give me the ability to drive this and keep my critical thinking, but help me to overcome the kind of initial blank white page. Things that Gen AI models are really, really bad at. Calculations. If you ask ChatGPT or Copilot to do a sum, much more than 80% of the time it's going to get the answer completely wrong, but it will look very convincing. So use a calculator. It can't, as we saw, can't label diagrams, can't really interpret what's going on in an image. It can't answer questions that are unusual. What I mean by that is if stuff isn't in its training data or hasn't been trained on lots and lots and lots of copies of that thing, it tends to kind of fall over. And you can't teach it new things. It's trained, that's it. You can't give it new skills by sort of prompting it with text. Not very good yet at driving cars. Can't really understand movies, can't tell you what the plot of a particular film might be. Teleoperate robots we'll come back to, but and really pretty bad at assessing whether they're right or not. As you saw, that we had a big argument about how many R's there are in strawberry, and I thought the answer was very obvious, and it simply did not let go of the fact that it was wrong, but it didn't think it was wrong. This is a phrase from a recent research publication, and we're coming into land now, but I want to give you a sort of rough overview of why all these things then get added into our strategy and our policy. So what we tend to find often is the fact that you can generate an image in 20 seconds feels like it should save you time. It definitely should. The fact that you can generate all this text in no time at all feels like it should be a speed increaser. But what people tend to find is that then you spend longer fixing that thing and not letting go of the thing that's wrong than you do if you'd actually started with your own page and been in control of the process throughout. And this is why generally, large firms are leading on this, but we're seeing this happen with smaller firms as well, that the AI adoption rate has gone up and up and up and up as people have been very, very excited about bringing these tools in, and then it has started to decline. And there's a famous paper, I've actually managed to obscure it, but it's the MIT research on AI adoption 2025. And it says very, very clearly that 95% of all AI pilots in companies in America failed. And what they mean by failed is they cost way more than they brought in. There was no return on investment, and they didn't add any value to the company. And so what we want to try and do as much as possible is avoid some of the mistakes that these super early adopters have made. So our strategy has always been to be not on so much of the front foot that we've given over the last 3 years. We could have given hundreds of thousands of pounds to someone like ChatGPT or OpenAI or Microsoft for extra licenses that gave us access to these amazing models. And if we had, we would have now been financially much worse off than we are at the moment by choosing to wait, choosing to see how these models can be used and how they're useful, and then make sure that we learn from those mistakes that we've seen from other people. So this is basically where I want to leave you, which is this is how you engage your critical thinking when you're using these AI tools, these AI image generators. Think of them as a C-grade student. So this is a picture of some students getting their GCSE results. You might be able to picture that moment yourself, that you were there with your friends, and you maybe got an A+ in something and you're super happy, and then maybe this kid at the back is a little bit disappointed because he got an F. Now, if you know that there's some area where you score an F, you're like, I don't know anything about that, I'm completely lost, I don't know what I'm doing, then a C grade student is going to drag you up. It's going to help you, but it won't get you to the point of being an expert. And it might answer some questions for you, but it's not going to turn you into someone who will suddenly have superhuman abilities. But it might overcome something. And I would say if there's an area where you score an F and you need it to be done, the first questions are, is there an expert in the company? Is there someone I need to go to about this? So great example, accounting. I'm terrible at accounting. I don't know where to even start, but I know it's important. And so I'm not going to outsource that to a generative AI that can't do calculations. So we have an accountant in the firm. We have a finance department because that's a job that needs to be done. However, if there's an area where you are an A+ expert, and actually if you're an architect or you are a technologist or an interior designer on this call, or even any of your job descriptions, you are almost certainly an expert at a deeper level than any generative AI. You have specific domain knowledge that these models do not. They're great at being average over breadth, but not going into depth. And so by you choosing to rely on AI, what you will generally find is it will drag you down. It will erode your critical thinking. This is actually sort of, there's an image on another slide, but this is actually what doctors have found. Yeah, there we go. Doctors get worse at detecting cancer after they've relied on AI. So our policy, just very, very briefly, ChatGPT, sort of, definitely very happy for people to use ChatGPT to help them with those things. Like I said, it isn't critical. It isn't going in front of a client. Accuracy isn't the end of the world. It's not under an NDA, so you're not sharing data outside of the company with that you wouldn't post on LinkedIn or Facebook. But as soon as you go to say, help me with this bid for a client that wants to remain anonymous, sharing any of that information in ChatGPT is going to be a very, very bad idea from a point of view of data protection and also just our duty of care to our clients. Now, Copilot's different. Copilot is built into lots of Microsoft things, and that comes with data protection. So anything you type into Copilot stays within ADP. You can use Copilot, and it's the same model as ChatGPT. It just doesn't look quite the same. Midjourney, there are risks with Midjourney, especially in terms of legal and copyright risks. But things like mood boarding, especially if you use Adobe Firefly, great. But presenting that work as renders, definitely not. So what we're going to say is this is kind of like Pinterest on steroids, but it isn't replacing the job of the work that we would otherwise still be clear that it's important enough to outsource it if we can't do renders in-house. So in all, use and exercise your critical judgment. Keep your critical judgment skills sharp, and ask if you're not sure. And there will be, I hope, an email following up with a link to this recording, and then also any of the articles and references that I've put in this presentation, including our AI policy, which you're very welcome to read. I'm afraid I've gone on a few minutes too late, and I do apologize, but I'm going to stop there, and I'm also going to make sure that everyone has a chance to ask any questions if you want to, and then we'll carry on with our days. Okay, well, I'm going to stop the recording there then, and I'll stay on the call if you want to ask any questions. Very, very welcome to. Otherwise, see you around, and happy prompting.